Utilitarianism. According to John Stuart Mill, the utilitarian doctrine is that happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being only desirable as means to that end. The basic idea of utilitarianism. The greatest happiness principle. Once again, according to John Stuart Mill, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Happiness is equal to pleasure and absence of pain. This means that utilitarian thinks that actions are good when they increase humanity's net happiness, creating more pleasure than they cause pain. Unhappiness is equal to pain and absence of pleasure. On the other hand, utilitarian thinks that actions are evil when they cause more pain than pleasure. Happiness is the only thing that has intrinsic value. If something has intrinsic value, it is good on its own and isn't utilized for attaining anything else. Pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things that desirable as ends. All desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. Background on utilitarianism. English philosopher John Stuart Mill 1806 to 1873 and Jeremy Bentham 1748 to 1832 were the leading proponents of what is now called classic utilitarianism. Classical utilitarianism is the ethical theory on which the rightness of actions or rules, policies, etc. depends on and only on the sum total of happiness over suffering they produce. The utilitarians were social reformers. They supported suffrage for women and those without property, and the abolition of slavery. Utilitarians argued that criminals ought to be reformed and not merely punished, although Mill did support capital punishment as deterrent. Bentham spoke out against cruelty to animals. Mill was a strong supporter of meritocracy. Proponents emphasized that utilitarianism was an egalitarian doctrine. Everyone's happiness counts equally. Utilitarianism is not a single viewpoint, but a family of related ethical theories. What these theories have in common are four defining elements. Number 1, consequentialism. Number 2, welfarism. Number 3, impartiality. And number 4, additive aggregationism. An accurate and comprehensive definition of utilitarianism will include the four elements. We can thus define the utilitarianism as follows. Is the ethical theory on which the rightness of actions or rules, policies, etc. depends on and only on the sum total of happiness over suffering they produce. All ethical theories belonging to the utilitarian family share four defining elements: consequentialism, welfarism, impartiality, additive aggregationism. Consequentialism is the view that the moral rightness of actions, rules, policies, etc. depends on, and only on, the value of their consequences. For instance, most people would agree that lying is wrong, but if telling a lie would help save a person's life, consequentialism says it's the right thing to do. Welfarism is the view that the only welfare, also called well-being, of individuals determines that how good a particular state of the world is. For example, utilitarians focus on the sum total of everyone's well-being and hold that an action is right if it maximizes this sum total. Impartiality is the view that the identity of individual is irrelevant to the value of an outcome. An example of impartial is the nature of a judge in a court case. Additive aggregationism is the view that the value of the world is given by the sum of the values of its parts, where these parts are some kind of local phenomena such as experiences, lives, or societies. Examples of additive aggregationism are egalitarianism, which is intrinsically values equality in the distribution of well-being, and prioritarianism, which regards benefits to the worse of as more important than benefits to the better of.
Good day everyone, I am Quennie Odoño and I am going to discuss the topic given to me, which is the classic utilitarianism and the four elements of utilitarianism. The utilitarianism is an ethical theory founded by Jeremy Bentham and developed and popularized by John Stuart Mill. Utilitarianism is a theory of morality that advocates action that foster happiness or pleasure and oppose action that cause unhappiness or harm. The early utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sidgwick, were classical utilitarians. Utilitarian is a person who holds the belief of utilitarianism. So these three classical utilitarians has a different theory about utilitarianism. So first is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was an English philosopher. He is also a founder of modern utilitarianism. He believed that utilitarianism is an ethical theory holding that actions are morally right if they tend to promote happiness or pleasure, and morally wrong if they tend to promote unhappiness or pain. Bentham's theory of utilitarianism focused on which actions were most likely to make people happy. If happiness was the experience of pleasure without pain, the most ethical actions were ones that caused the most possible happiness and the least possible pain. But John Stuart Mill, a student of Bentham's, disagreed. He believed that we should figure out which set of rules would create the most happiness over an extended period of time and then apply those in every situation. Mill defines utilitarianism as theory based on the principle that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Last is Henry Sidgwick. Henry Sidgwick was also an English philosopher. He believed that utilitarianism seeks to contribute to the happiness of all persons affected by the act. So that is their theory of utilitarianism. So now let's proceed to the classic utilitarianism. Classical utilitarianism differs from other utilitarian theories in that it accepts two additional elements. First, hedonism is a theory of happiness. Hedonism is the belief that happiness consists of both positive and negative conscious experience. Positive conscious experience will be referred to as happy, while negative conscious experience will be referred to as suffering. Second, classical utilitarianism accepts the total view of population ethics. The total view of population ethics regards one outcome as better than another if and only if it contains greater total well-being, even if this is simply due to having more people. To put it simply, classical utilitarianism is an ethical theory in which the rightness of actions is determined solely by the total of happiness produced over suffering. So now let's apply it to a real life situation. As an example, when you are selecting ice cream for yourself, the utilitarian viewpoint holds that you should select the flavor that will provide you with the greatest pleasure. If you like chocolate but dislike vanilla, you should choose chocolate for the pleasure it will bring and avoid vanilla for the displeasure it will bring. Furthermore, if you enjoy both chocolate and strawberry, you should predict which flavor will give you the most pleasure and choose that flavor, and that is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a demanding ethical theory that may require us to substantially change how we act. Utilitarianism says that we should make helping others a very significant part of our lives. In helping others, we should try to use our resources to do the most good, impartially considered that we can. According to utilitarianism, we should extend our moral concern to all sentient beings, meaning every individual capable of experiencing positive or negative conscious states. On this basis, a priority for utilitarians may be to help society to continue to widen its moral circle of concern. For instance, we may want to persuade people they should help not just those in their own country, but also people on the other side of the world, not just those of their own species, but all sentient creatures, and not just people currently alive, but any people who lives they can affect. So, utilitarianism has significant implications for how we should consider living an ethical life. The theory rejects the moral distinction between causing and permitting harm. This point of view adds to utilitarianism difficulty by implying that whenever we choose not to help other person, we are complicit in their misery. So, according to utilitarianism, we should carefully choose which moral problems to work on and how to work on them. Based on where we can do the most good, we should extend our moral concern to all sentient beings, that is, to all individuals who are capable of experiencing happiness or suffering. Utilitarianism encourages us to consider the well-being of all individuals, regardless of species, country, or time period in which they exist. Despite having radically different approach to ethics than common sense morality, utilitarianism generally endorses common sense prohibition. For a practical purpose, the best course of action for a utilitarian is to try to do as much good as possible while still acting in accordance with common sense moral virtues, like integrity, trustworthiness, law-abidingness, and fairness. Common sense morality is a key concept of moral philosophy. Each person in society gets exposed to a common sense morality. This morality consists of a wide variety of standards of conduct, duties, obligation, values, and principles that come from disparate sources, such as parents, teachers, peers, religious leaders, professionals, literature, music, the media, and so forth. Ethicists call this standard of common sense morality because they are the norms that most people learn and practice without any explicit theorizing or deeper analysis. So, a couple of examples of common sense moral judgment may be things like it is wrong to kill innocent people for no reason. Injustice is unjustified unless some greater good is gained from it. People are, for the most part, morally responsible for their actions, necessarily intended for a certain consequence of their actions. So now let's proceed to the four elements of utilitarianism. First is the consequentialism. Consequentialism is the view that the moral rightness of actions depends on and only on the value of their consequences. Thus, to evaluate whether an action is right or wrong, we should look at all of its consequences, rather than any of its other features. For instance, when breaking a promise has bad consequence, as it usually does, consequentialists consider it wrong to do so. However, breaking a promise is not considered wrong in and of itself. In exceptional cases, breaking a promise would be morally permissible or even required, such as when doing so is necessary to save a life. So, consequentialism is sometimes criticized because it can be difficult or even impossible to know what the result of an action will be ahead of time. Also, in a certain situation, consequentialism can lead to decisions that are objectionable even though the consequences are arguably good. Consequentialism is an ethical theory that judges whether or not something is right by what its consequences are. For instance, most people would agree that lying is wrong, but if telling a lie would help save a person's life, consequentialism says it is the right thing to do. Common distinction in the philosophical literature is between two views called direct consequentialism and indirect consequentialism. According to direct view, the rightness of an action depends only on its consequence. On this view, to determine the right action is some set of feasible action, we should directly evaluate the consequence of the action to see which has the best consequences. The best known direct view is act utilitarianism, which directly assesses the moral rightness of and only of actions. In contrast, according to the indirect consequentialism, we should evaluate the moral status of an action based on its relationship to something else whose status itself assessed in terms of its consequence. The most famous indirect view is known as rule utilitarianism. So, both act utilitarians and rule utilitarians agree that our overall aim in evaluating action should be to create the best results possible, but they differ about how to do that. Act utilitarians believe that whenever we are deciding what to do, we should perform the action that will create the greatest net utility. In their view, the principle of utility, do whatever will produce the best overall result, should be applied on a case by case basis. The right action in any situation is the one that yields more utility than other available actions. While rule utilitarianism is a form of utilitarianism that says an action is right as it conforms to a rule that leads to a greatest good, or that the rightness or wrongness of a particular action is a function of a correctness of the rule of which it is instance. So, an act utilitarians focus on the effects of individual actions, while rule utilitarians focus on the effects of type of actions, such as killing or stealing. So next is welfarism. Welfarism is the view that only the welfare, also called well-being, of individuals determines how good or particular state of the world is. Therefore, from the welfarist perspective, good consequences are those which increase well-being in the world, while bad consequences are those which decrease it. Philosophers use the term well-being to describe everything that is good for a person in itself, as opposed to do things only instrumentally good for a person. For example, money can buy many useful things and is thus good for a person instrumentally, but it is not a component of their well-being. So, welfarism is a theory about what has value or what matters. It can be defined as the view that well-being is the only thing that has intrinsic value. Pure welfarists hold that this value is directly determined by the individual degrees of well-being of each entity. So next is the impartiality. Impartiality is the view that the identity of individuals is irrelevant to the value of an outcome. Accepting impartiality means treating well-being as equally valuable regardless of when, where, or to whom it occurs. As utilitarian philosopher Henry Sidgwick states, the good of any one person is no more important from the point of view of the universe than the good of any other. As a consequence, utilitarians value the well-being of all individuals equally regardless of their nationality, gender, where or when they live, or even their species. According to utilitarianism, you should not even privilege the well-being of yourself or your family over the well-being of distant strangers. So, impartiality is defining feature of the moral outlook raises obvious questions and difficulties in relation to our ordinary beliefs and behaviors. Also, impartiality is sometimes treated by philosophers as if it were equivalent to moral impartiality, or at the very least, the former word is often used without a qualifying adjective moral even when it is the particularly moral concept that is intended. Impartial is not favoring one side or opinion more than another. For example, while having food and clothing is clearly a good, it seems that I have a special obligation to my own children over the children of strangers to make sure that they have food and clothing. So we have two moral claims: impartiality. When it comes to morality, we should be impartial. So the last is added, additive aggregationism. According to utilitarianism, the overall value in the world is given by the sum total of well-being in it. This means utilitarians accept additive aggregationism, which is defined as follows. Additive aggregationism is the view that the value of the world is the sum of the values of its parts, where these parts are local phenomena such as experiences, lives, or societies. This view implies that we can meaningfully compare and trade off the well being of individuals and groups of individuals by adding up their well being. For example, utilitarianism claims that improving 5 lives by some amount is better than improving 1 life by same amount, and that is 5 times better. So, additive aggregationism is a theory of how to aggregate the well being of individuals. It is the view that the value of the world is sum of the values of its parts, where these parts are local phenomena such as experience.
Two examples of classical utilitarianism. First is theories of well-being hedonism. Hedonism says that how good or bad our life can be in a matter of our happiness and pain that we are experiencing in our life. For example, way back during our childhood time, we really like candies and chocolate just to receive a candy to make us so happy. Or there are times that we buy a lot of candies in the store and eat it all by ourselves. We enjoyed eating sweet without brushing our teeth afterwards that causes us to suffer toothache and can also cause for our teeth to slowly decay. At first, it gives us pleasure and happiness, but afterwards, it gives us pain and makes us suffer.
Utilitarians agree that if the number of people that were ever to exist is held constant, we should promote the sum total of well-being in that fixed population. But in reality, the population is not fixed. We have the option of bringing more people into existence, such as by having children. If these additional people would have good lives, is that a way of making the world better? This question falls on the domain of population ethics because the situation explains the population, which deals with the moral problems that arise when our actions affect who and how many people are born and at what quality of life.
Second is population ethics, the total view. It means that there are two ways to improve the world. First is to make the people who already exist have a better life or increase the population of people who can live happily. But there is something wrong with the second choice, since we are not sure if the people that will be added will surely live a happy life, and the increase of population may just lead to overpopulation and shortage since our planet has only limited resources. Example, reason 1. We can make the existing people happy by providing them what they need or ain't money, clothes, house, and many more. Reason 2. Adding more people through reproduction. Two types of utilitarianism: accruals and preference utilitarianism. In utilitarianism is deciding what to do for themselves alone, considering only their own utility. For example, buying an ice cream for yourself. You will choose the flavor that will give you the most pleasure, That is act of utilitarianism. In rule, utilitarianism would say that murder is morally wrong because it leads to reduced utility and happiness in society. In preference utilitarianism, it is distinct from original utilitarianism in that it values action that fulfill the most personal interest as opposed to action that generate the most pleasure. For example, you are curious about the diary of your friend and you want it to know even she said that she don't want it to share. Because of your desire, you read it without her consent. This violates your friend's preference even if she never finds out.
Hello, everyone. I am Ronald Jebulan Jr. I was tasked to report in this slide from 20 to 25, and my topic is about specific objections about utilitarianism. Now, let us begin. So, the rights objection charges utilitarianism with being overly permissive. To maximize the sum total of welfare, utilitarianism requires one sometimes to violate others' rights or seeming moral constraints such as the prohibition against lying or killing. Second, we discussed the objection that utilitarianism is overly demanding because it requires people to undergo excessive self-sacrifice in order to help others. Third, we discussed the objections that utilitarianism is not sufficiently concerned with distributive justice and value of equality. And now I am to discuss these three parts of utilitarianism, which is the right objection, the demandingness objection, and the equality objection. Let us start with the rights objection. According to common sense morality and many non-utilitarian theories, there are certain moral constraints you should never violate. Ano nga ba ang meaning ng constraints? Constraints mean the limitation or restriction from doing something. These constraints are expressed in moral rules like do not lie and do not kill. These rules are intuitively very plausible. So, ano nga ba ang ibig sabihin nun na very intuitively plausible? It means baseless hunch, kumbaga. Baseless in terms of parang gut feeling lang siya na you feel like that it's true without even facts or to support, but still true. This represents a problem to utilitarianism. So, yung problema dito sa utilitarianism is that it doesn't focus on the act itself to form judgments. The one disadvantage that utilitarianism cannot escape is that it focuses more on the outcome of the choice instead of the act itself. There is no moral judgment on the actual actions that a person chooses to take. The reason for this that utilitarianism not only specifies which outcomes are best, those having the highest overall of well-being, but also says that it would be wrong to fail to realize these outcomes. Sometimes realizing the best outcomes requires violating moral constraints against harming others, that is, violating their rights. There is no reason to expect common sense moral rules to always coincide with the best ways to act according to utilitarianism. Indeed, we sometimes observe them conflicting. Yung mga anti-utilitarianism, ang sabi nila, may mga certain moral constraints na we should not violate, like lying and killing, which is again very intuitively plausible based sa ginamit na term. Kasi nga naman talaga, di ba? Mahirap man i-explain, pero as morally upright people, hindi pa din tama ang magsinungaling at pumatay. Ngayon, this is a problem daw for utilitarianism. O kumbaga parang loophole siya para kay utilitarianism. Bakit? Based from the definition of utilitarianism online, the doctrine that actions are right if they are useful for the benefit of majority. Meaning, regardless of the action, as long as nag-benefit ang majority, tama pa din daw. E paano pala, for example, killing drug addicts for the benefit of the Philippines? Is it still right? Tama pa din ba yung utilitarianism sa part na yun? Siyempre, depends on the goal. If the goal is to lessen the use of drugs, I think it is. It is a non-pragmatic utilitarian choice. If it's for the benefits of the Philippines, there are so many ways to bring beneficial effects to the country. Imagine a hypothetical scenario in which there are 5 patients, each of whom will soon die unless they receive an appropriate transplanted organ, a heart, 2 kidneys, a liver, and lungs. A healthy patient, Chuck, comes into the hospital for a routine checkup, and the doctor finds that Chuck is a perfect match as a donor for all his 5 patients. Should the doctor kill Chuck and use his organs to save 5 others? At first glance, it seems that utilitarianism has to answer the question with yes, the doctor should kill Chuck. It is better that 5 people live than 1 person lives. But in common sense morality and virtually every other moral theory, the answer is no, do not kill Chuck. In fact, on most views, killing Chuck would be morally monstrous. This apparent counterintuitive complication of utilitarian is taken as an argument against utilitarianism being the correct moral theory. For me, I wouldn't intervene if it doesn't concern me at all. I would just let the current situation decide their fate. But if I were to decide their fate, I would consider picking the options with less damages, and as stated in the link provided by Professor Alan Busa in the presentation, utilitarianism does not imply that the doctor should kill him. Rather, it shows us the dilemma of the possibility in saving the life of 5 people for the price of 1 or not saving them at all. Hence, utilitarian forces and insists that Chuck should sacrifice his life for the greater good of the 5 and by means of violating his right to live. Like, come on. Chuck went there for his routine checkup, and what did he do to get to this point? Another example that I found on Google is the trolley problem. The trolley problem is a thought experiment first devised by the Oxford moral philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967. Firstly, the trolley problem is a series of thought experiments in ethics and psychology involving stylized ethical dilemmas of whether to sacrifice 1 person to save a larger number. This series usually begins with a scenario in which a runway tram or trolley is on a course to collide with and kill a number of people, traditionally 5, down the track. But a driver or a bystander can intervene and divert the vehicle to kill just 1 person on a different track. You are near a lever to change the train tracks. You have only 2 choices. Do not do nothing, in which case the trolley will kill 5 people on the main track. Second, pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track where it will kill 1 person. And in this endpoint, I have came up that the core values of utilitarianism is altruism and selflessness. The greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Sometimes, to attain true utilitarian choice, you will have to infringe rights, like when the South Korean government accessed everyone's personal data even without their consent for a much faster and efficient contact tracing, or making COVID vaccination mandatory for the sake of attaining herd immunity, thereby ignoring an individual's right on whether or not to be inoculated. We are about to tackle the second part, which is specific objections about utilitarianism, the demanding objection. So the given meaning is that many critics argue that utilitarianism is too demanding because it requires us to always act such as to bring the best outcome. The theory leaves no room for actions that are permissible yet do not bring out the best consequences. Philosophers label such actions that are morally good but not required supererogatory. Utilitarianism and many other forms of consequentialism deny that action can be supererogatory. As a result, some critics claim that utilitarianism is morally only for saints. As a matter of fact, very few people, including utilitarian philosophers, live their life in perfect accordance with utilitarianism. For instance, consider the money of a person spends on dining out could pay for several bed nets, each protecting 2 children in a low-income country from malaria about 2 years. So the thing is that it's being suggested here is that imbes na igastos ng isang tao yung pera niya sa pagbili ng pagkain sa labas, which is yung money holder lang yung magbe-benefit. Para naman kay utilitarianism, sinasuggest niya na 2 bata ang magiging masaya gamit yung pera na yon at mas maganda pa yung magiging outcome since 2 yung beneficiary. So dito napapasok yung pagiging demanding ng utilitarianism na re-require tayo na mag-act ayon sa best outcome. Kumbaga, dapat natin mas i-consider yung 2 bata na makikinabang kesa dun sa isang person na kakain lang sa labas. From a utilitarian perspective, the benefit to the person dining out is much smaller than the benefit to the children from not having malaria. So it would seem that the person has acted wrongly in choosing to have a meal out. Analogous reasoning applies to how we use our time. The hours you spend on social media should apparently be spent volunteering for charity or working harder at one's job to earn more money to donate. To many people, these extremes obligations of utilitarianism seems absurd. Absurd in terms of parang kalokohan na daw at first glance. According naman daw kay common sense morality, we are permitted to spend most of our incomes on ourselves, our loved ones, and on our personal projects. Insofar as charity goes, common sense morality holds that while it is good and praiseworthy to donate, it is not obligatory. Kapuri-puri nga naman talaga sa isang tao na magtulong and set aside yung sarili niya just for charity, but as stated, hindi obligado ang pagtulong. You are not obliged to help others. And the last of my part, specific objections about utilitarianism, the equality objection. So the given meaning is, some argue that utilitarianism conflicts with the ideal of equality. Suppose, for example, that you could choose between 2 possible distribution of well-being, equality and inequality. Equality has 1,000 people at well-being level 45, while inequality has 500 people at 80 well-being and another 500 at 20 well-being. By the lights of utilitarianism, only the sum total of well-being determines the goodness of an outcome. It does not matter how that well-being is distributed across people. Since the sum total of well-being is greater in equality than equality, the unequal outcome is preferable according to utilitarianism. Some philosophers object to the utilitarian view regarding this choice, claiming that the equal distribution of well-being in equality provides a reason to choose this outcome. On this view, total being is not all that matters. Equality of distribution also matters. Equality, it is claimed, is an important moral consideration that utilitarianism overlooks. Sabi dito ay medyo in conflict ang utilitarianism and equality. Example na lang yung image above. For example, sa equality, equal lahat ng tao na level 45 yung well-being nila. Tas sa inequality naman ay half of the population is yung 80 yung well-being, tas yung other half is 20. Syempre kasi unequal nga, 'di ba? 'Di ba nga ang utilitarianism mahalaga ang majority or yung sum total. So kung pagbabasehan uli natin ang utilitarianism, mas in favor ang utilitarianism sa inequality versus equality because equality is equal to 45 well-being lang, which is ang total ay 1,000 person na. Tas inequality, 20 people at 80 well-being, 500 people. Tapos yung isa, 20 well-being, yung 500 na people, which is again another loophole for utilitarianism, because dapat daw equality is enough to choose equality rather than just the overall well-being, because ang equality ay isa ding importanteng moral consideration na dinidisregard ng utilitarianism.
Hi, this is Rica Peñalba, and this slide contains the strengths and weaknesses of utilitarianism.
Just like other theories, utilitarianism has also its own strengths and weaknesses. So this part, the strength part, explains that you will be happy if you follow utilitarianism, since the major goal or objective of this is to seek, find, and predict happiness in order to avoid unhappiness or harm. But we should not just rely on its strength. We must also know utilitarian's weaknesses. So this part, the weaknesses part, explains that yes, we know that the goal of utilitarianism is to seek or foresee the consequences. But the problem is that we, or even you, cannot predict what will happen next or what will happen to you, and it may not be what you intended or expected. We should put in mind that happiness can be found in anything, not just in what you do, because sometimes happiness can be found in a certain thing or object. So the next slide is all about deontology versus consequentialism. When we say deontology, it examines the rightness or wrongness of actions without focusing on their effect to determine if they are right or wrong, while consequentialism, on the other hand, examines the effects of actions to decide whether they are right or wrong. So to make it easier for us to understand, we should remember that deontology are most easily understood than consequentialism. Why? Because consequentialist holds that we should choose the available actions with the best overall consequences, while deontologists hold that we should act in ways constrained by moral rules or rights, and these moral rules or rights are defined independently of consequences. So, how can we apply deontology and consequentialism in a certain situation? For example, how can we determine whether lying or killing is morally right or wrong? So, in consequentialism, it will explain that the rightness or wrongness of lying or killing must be explained by consequences. If it has good consequences, then it may be right to lie or to kill. If it has bad consequences, then it may be wrong to lie or to kill. So mm, sa pinaka-easiest na paraan ng pagkakaintindi, ang consequentialism appeals and focuses more on the consequences of an actions. But in deontology, it explains that the rightness or wrongness of killing or lying cannot be explained simply by its consequences. The actions of lying or killing are often wrong in themselves independently of whether they have good consequences. Deontologists might say that it is morally wrong to lie, so I will tell the person the truth. But in consequentialism, it might say that I will tell the truth to this person because if I lie, he or she will not trust me anymore. Next slide is all about Kantianism versus utilitarianism. Kantianism is a moral philosophy introduced by Immanuel Kant that emphasizes the morality of an action or decision is not determined by its consequences, but by the motivation of the doer. So Kantianism, on the other hand, is a deontological moral theory that says actions are either good or bad based on a set of principles. So for example, I borrowed a money from a friend, and I promised that I pay her back. But when deciding whether to keep my promise, I must consider my action could be universalized. My mind can go something like, I could lie and break my promise. So utilitarianism, on the other hand, is a teleological moral theory, which means it defines good behavior as that which produces the best outcomes. It is a moral philosophy introduced by Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Henry Sidgwick that emphasizes the morality of an action or decision as determined by its consequences. So kung sa Kantianism, it is not determined by its consequences, sa utilitarianism, it is determined by consequences. We can say that an action is a utilitarianism when individuals are deciding what to do for themselves alone and they consider only their own utility. For example, you are going to buy an ice cream, but it takes time for you to choose because you want all the flavor. So, in utilitarianism, you must choose the flavor that will give you happiness or most pleasure. Slide is all about um, supererogation. So when we say supererogation, it is defined as going above and beyond what is expected of you. It is the act of going above and beyond what is required of you. So when I have done enough by way of helping others, sa act of utilitarianism, it explains that you will never come that far. There is no point at which you are permitted to do no more. But in supererogation, for you, you help others because it is your duty. You are acting beyond duty. Pero sa deontology, there comes a point perhaps hard to determine at which you have an option not to do more. So, meron kang option kung gagawin mo ba ang action na yon. So, examples of supererogation are the doctor traveling to a plague-ridden society to save lives, the beneficent person who donates a lot of money to charity, the victim who forgives the wrongdoer, the soldier throwing himself upon a live grenade to save his comrade. So, sa mga nabanggit ko, bakit example siya ng supererogation? Example yon ng supererogation because it is an example of supererogatory act. Ang supererogatory acts are heroic and saintly deeds that require significant deal of sacrifice and risk. So therefore, pag sinabi dating supererogatory, it is beneficial but not morally obligatory. So yung doctor na nag-travel sa ibang place just to save lives, it is example of supererogation because it is an example of heroic deeds. Same with the beneficent person who donates money to a charity. Ang sa the victim who forgives the wrongdoer, naging example siya ng supererogation kasi it is beneficial. Kumbaga, nagkaroon ng benefits yung victim and yung wrongdoer. Napatawad ng victim yung wrongdoer, so both of them have the benefits. And yung the soldier throwing himself upon a live grenade to save his comrades is really an example of supererogation because it is an act of heroism. So, sa babang part ng slide na to, meron ditong example. Example 1 is, what is a nurse's role's obligation to desperate terminally ill patients who cling to the nurse for comfort in their few remaining days? So, ano nga ba yung role ng nurse dito? In supererogation, the nurse should support the patient and family by educating them on what they might expect to happen during this time. Next one is, what about treatment of HIV-infected patients? It is treatment of such patients optional or required? Sa example naman na ito, may choices if it's optional or required. But, ang sagot dito, kasi we tackled supererogation, ang sagot po dito is required. Required na magpa-treat ang HIV-infected patient kasi, according to supererogation, yung act na gagawin mo is the act that beyond what is required for you. Therefore, uh, nag-undergo ng treatment ang isang HIV-infected patient kasi required yun sa kanya. Yun yung makatutulong para gumaling siya. Last one is firefighters entering the twin tours or towers in 9/11. It is an example of supererogatory or required. Ito naman po sa example 3, it is an example of supererogatory. Kasi pinapakita dito ang kabayanihan or act of heroism ng mga firefighters. Because as I've said kanina, ang supererogatory acts are heroic and saintly deeds that requires a significant deal of sacrifice and risk.
Again, this is Rica Jane Ladak Peñalba, and that concludes our report about utilitarianism.